Okay, sorry about the technical delay there. Cape Ann, as probably I don't have to tell anybody in this room, is an amazing collection, if you want to call that, of biological diversity. Plants, mammals, birds, insects, the whole 9 yards. To give you an idea of that, I was reading through some literature recently, and some scientists, some lepidopterists, those are scientists who study butterflies and moths, not too long ago did a study and recorded 440 plus species of mostly moths, almost all moths, okay? And they indicated, based on the fact that at the rate at which they were adding new species during their survey, and the fact that they were only able to cover a certain amount of territory, that there were probably more than 1,000 species of moths on Cape Ann. Now, some of those, of course, were habitats that don't occur in Dogtown, but most would. So you can think of Dogtown as having thousands of species of moths alone. Now, you'll probably be relieved to hear that I'm not going to spend my time talking to you about moths. Although there are some spectacular moths in Dogtown, including 4 or 5 state-listed species, state rare species. But what I am going to talk to you about is about time and changes in landscape and habitat, both of which greatly affect biological diversity, and I'll hope to be able to demonstrate that. Let's see here. I'm having a little bit of a light problem. Let's see if that works. Okay, we're good. So Cindy was talking about, what is Dogtown? Well, it's true. There are a lot of different kinds of definitions and many more opinions about what Dogtown is. But this is actually a pretty decent map that's based on both sort of trail routes. It does include North Gloucester Woods. As you can see, that sort of black dotted line, that's the Rockport-Gloucester boundary. And so this is a pretty good map of the 3,000 to 4,000 acres of Dogtown, and again, almost completely undeveloped. As Cindy was pointing out, and I won't show you some of the complex maps that we've developed as part of the new commission, but of which I'm vice chair, by the way, because it's quite complex. But pretty much everything inside that yellow line is undeveloped in some ways in all the different categories that Cindy mentioned. Sorry, I'm just, okay, I think I got it now. Okay, so we're going to start at the beginning, so to speak, in terms of changes in landscape and time. Those of you a certain age will remember the era of the great collection of land masses that occurred originally down at the southern end of the planet, Pangaea and Gondwana. At that point, and this is kind of where we're talking now 400 million years ago, more or less. And at this point, there was volcanic activity, and this was the first emergence of what we might call Gloucester geology on the face of on the surface. Let's see. Sorry about this. I'm just having. Following that period, going again much further ahead in history, you will recall, sort of, that some 14,000 years ago, there was a massive glacier across North America that covered the landscape well to the south, including Cape Ann. This is actually the great Argentine glacier in Patagonia, but this is an idea of somewhat of what it looked like here for thousands of years. And of course, so what I'm going to show you next is kind of the process, the ecological, the biological process that occurs after the glacier starts to move out. So you have the glacier on top of Gloucester stone, for example. Nothing under it particularly, but stone, although there was, of course, before the glacier arrived. And this is just an example of the southernmost reach of the glacier. And you can see Cape Ann well buried there, all of New England pretty much. And what happens after the glacier retreats is what's known as succession, biological succession. And this diagram kind of shows that process. So there are so-called pioneer stages. You start with bare rock, a few lichens develop, remembering that lichens are a combination of an alga and a fungus with a few other elements thrown in there, as recently discovered. And then, small, aggressive, hardy plants start to occur. And as they decay and deteriorate and soil develops, you develop more herbs, grasses, things like that. And the process continues all the way to what's called, in some terminology, a climax community, climax forest. That doesn't always mean a robust forest, depending on what climate zone you're in, but that's the ultimate in this basic progression. This is the Quarried Halibut Point, just to demonstrate that we still, even though we have some vegetation growing on top, we're still plentifully supplied with rock here on Cape Ann, so that the vestige of that stony stage still remains. We also have an abundance of a variety of lichens. Many of you are probably familiar with that wonderful orange shore lichen that's actually a wonderful dye ingredient. And so this is just a variety of lichens for that stage. A variety of hardy grasses. This is little bluestem grass. It's actually a native grass. The vast majority of the grasses that we see, looking out the window here or along the highway are European pasture grasses that were introduced. They're not invasive species necessarily, but they are non-native species, though those non-native species are used by many native species of butterflies, for example, for food plants, nectaring, and that kind of thing. But this is a true native plant. Little bluestem grass, which you still sometimes see in patches. It's wonderful feathery inflorescences that you see sort of in the fall. So that would have come in, and this is sort of pictures of various areas in various parts of the world in terms of what Cape Ann might have looked like as it went through these stages, as the glacier retreated and the climate became a little milder and the plant communities developed. So this is Arctic tundra. This is in a place called Bathurst Inlet in northern Canada. And you can see lots of different low-lying Arctic wildflowers and also small shrubs and also grasses sort of mixed in. So there was a time when Cape Ann probably looked something like this, different species, no doubt. And following that, you started, especially in areas that had richer soil as the soil developed and there was water available, coniferous forest. And if you go to places like this in Canada today or northern New England, you'll see large areas of spruce and fir, and again, associated wetlands. Whoops. And then finally, you start to get in, again, with appropriate soils and things, deciduous woodlands coming in, eventually leading to mature forest. This and a couple of another scene I've got are basically from the dioramas at Harvard Forest. If you've never visited that museum at Harvard Forest in Petersham, it's worth a look. They have a wonderful diorama of changes in the New England landscape there. And so that, eventually Cape Ann, at the time of Native Americans being here, and we'll hear much more about that from Mary Ellen LeBianca tomorrow. Excuse me?
This afternoon.
Oh, this afternoon. Sorry about that. Yes, thank you for the correction. There would have been, major mature forests here, including trees like this, and there are still a few trees like that, not dating, of course, from that earliest period. But we no longer have serious mature forest of any extent in Dogtown. One of the things that, again, casting our minds back before there were fire departments and civilization, quote unquote, it's important to understand that, that there were natural cataclysms that occurred, not just in Dogtown, but across the planet, that are responsible really for creating the habitats that encouraged, nurtured biodiversity, the biodiversity, the evolution of different kinds of plants and animals. Different kinds of plants and animals, or animals live in grasslands than live in forests, and those all evolved based on the fact that there were grasslands and forests. Well, if everything was going towards forests, where did those grasslands and shrublands and all that come from? They came from natural, we're fond of calling them disasters, but really they were the early ecological management system. So fire, wooden habitations, fire departments and things like that, was a sort of natural management system and was responsible for creating a lot of these different habitats. And the same is true of other kinds of cataclysms, things that we are fearful of today, rightly so, things like hurricanes, great storms. This is an example of a blowdown that occurred during a major storm someplace, and you can see what happens here. What happens is that these trees don't immediately regrow as they were. These places where all the trees were blown down and knocked down turn into a different habitat. Perhaps a grassland. This is a northern area, which it seems to be, given the look of the vegetation. Maybe a heathland develops, and that's how biological diversity basically evolves. That's how it works. Floods, another example, that will clear a landscape, allowing other different habitats and landscape types to emerge. Of course, Native Americans, as well as early settlers and things, also burned for various reasons, often to open up the forest for better hunting opportunities, or just to clear the land. And this is an example, again, this is another diorama from Harvard Forest. This is what most of Massachusetts looked like. This looks like Western Massachusetts, but this is what most of Massachusetts looked like in Thoreau's time, sort of middle of the 19th century, for example, during which the vast majority of forest had been cleared by people and turned into agricultural land, farmland. 75% of Massachusetts was farmland during that period. So go through tremendous periods of change, which we tend a little bit to forget the history of. So going back to that era, and here I'm reminded of the quote we heard about, Dogtown as Stonehenge, so to speak. This is what Dogtown looked like during that farming period. There were farms, there was livestock, including cows, including many sheep, etc. And they changed the landscape from that forested landscape that I showed earlier to this very open landscape. And this, in some ways, perhaps romantic ways, I don't know how you would regard that, but as sort of the Dogtown, the quintessential Dogtown, the poetic Dogtown. This is the Dogtown that, and this occurred, this landscape looked like this not that long ago. You don't have to go back to the 1900s to have had this landscape. You can see Whale's Jaw there in the distance. There was a time when a friend here, she's gone now, told me that if you stood near the Cherry Street entrance of Dogtown, which we'll enter tomorrow, those of you who are going on my walk, you could see Whale's Jaw in the distance, which is hard to imagine today given the change in vegetation. Just another view of Whale's Jaw. And again, draw your attention away from the amazing stones to the sort of the heathy vegetation that again was referred to earlier. This is Peter's Pulpit, another great erratic. And this is Marston Hartley's. You have a wonderful collection of Marston Hartley's cards there, and this is a famous one called Rock Doxology. Yes, question?
Is it by fire or by cutting down trees? Just curious.
A variety of things. Initially, a lot of cutting down of trees, probably some fire. I don't think that was a major clearing effect, except, early on, like I say, the Native Americans cleared the understory to a certain extent. But I think, so you think of agricultural people coming on the land, seeing it covered with trees. They would harvest the trees for lumber, for building and other purposes, clear any undergrowth or whatever, possibly sort of do some burning. And then, as is the case, if you were to go back to, again, the 19th century at some point, many of these landscapes, including places that have, beautiful mansions on them now, Marblehead Neck or East Gloucester or whatever, were covered with sheep. And the sheep munched things down to this stage, more or less, or to the stage I showed you before. And that's how the so-called Gloucester moorlands, of which we still have some tiny vestiges, and I'll talk about that in a minute, emerged. So, in a nutshell. Please do, by the way, ask questions. There'll be time for questions at the end, but if something occurs to you that you think you'll forget, by all means, speak up. So, the next stage, this is actually a modern picture of Rockport, but if you forget the trees, the next thing that would sort of emerge after this, that sort of total sort of rocky, almost rocky desert-like aspect, would be grasses, as they were allowed to develop into hay fields and things of that kind. And as I was pointing out earlier, all of these different habitats have different organisms associated with them. I could spend hours, which I'm definitely not going to do, and you wouldn't want me to do, talking about the variety of different mammals, birds, insects, that occur in these different habitats. But I'll give you examples, mainly based on bird life. So in these grasslands, and of course this doesn't just apply to Dogtown or Cape Ann, there are certain characteristic species, almost all of which are now in serious decline. You probably all know that songbirds in general are in serious decline, having lost something like 30% of all the populations of songbirds in North America. But one of them, one of the species, not a songbird, of course, is the American kestrel, this beautiful little falcon. This used to be a common, many of you may remember, those of you who are interested in birds, going out in Essex County, around Cape Ann or whatever, seeing a kestrel was like, oh, there's a kestrel, no big deal. Beautiful bird, but not something to particularly remark as some rarity. Upland sandpiper. This is a bird that needs both tall grassland and short grassland. Tall grassland to nest in, and short grassland to feed in and bring its young to feed in. This bird is almost completely extinct in Massachusetts now. There used to be at least one nest site on Cape Ann historically, but there were, when I was a kid back in the dark ages, there were many sites in Massachusetts. They gradually got reduced to, interestingly, municipal and military airports, because those were among the few places that had those two kinds of extensive areas of those two kinds of grasslands. It's called a sandpiper. It's in that family, but it's a grassland bird, essentially, not a shore bird. Eastern meadowlark. This is another bird that, if you drove around any areas, including certain areas in Rockport, eastern meadowlarks were common birds on fence posts, on telephone wires, etc. And they have declined precipitously. As far as I know, they no longer breed on Cape Ann, and I kind of pay attention to what breeds on Cape Ann in terms of bird life. And they, in addition to the decline and the lack of current grasslands, they're also, and this is true of a lot of songbirds, have been decimated by toxics in the atmosphere. These birds, as well as American kestrels, both depended on large insects in order to survive. That's their main food. And so that group of organisms has been very hard hit by astonishing array, and we keep learning more about that, of pesticides, both agricultural and otherwise. This is a Vesper sparrow, used to be locally common species, once bred on Cape Ann, gone. I haven't seen a Vesper sparrow in Massachusetts for at least a decade. So, so this, as the grasslands matured, if that's the right word, and the farmland was let go, this would be a typical landscape. So you've got more robust shrubbery, not such low heathland, and red cedar or juniper is a pioneer species that comes in when farmland is abandoned. So if you see a landscape like that, you can say categorically, oh, this used to be farmland that's succeeded to this next stage. And this, you'll remember the early picture I showed you of Peter's Pulpit, this is what's happened to Dogtown, okay? So that this rockscape that Marsden Hartley and John Sloan and other artists were so fond of, and that many people thought of as the quintessential Dogtown landscape, is now obscured because of natural succession, but natural succession that nobody has thought about perhaps managing in order to preserve at least part of Dogtown in this historic landscape. Now, there'll be people that are totally against that who say, just let nature take its course. Leave it alone, they'll say. Let Dogtown be Dogtown. Well, as I hope I've demonstrated, that's really not the way nature operates. And of course, the way humans are operating these days is not a particularly great model. So I would suggest that there's possibly a way of managing Dogtown in a way that gets us maximum biological diversity, as well as a restoration, at least in part, sorry, my finger is getting ahead of me, of some of what is essentially is quintessential sort of Dogtown. So you have to go looking for Peter's Pulpit these days. And so ultimately we get to what's close to mature forest in Dogtown, like this, red oak, white birch, and a variety of other, serious native forest tree species. Nothing wrong with that. There certainly should be a part of Dogtown, a significant part, that is mature forest, because it contains its own unique species. Among them, broad-winged hawk, okay, relatively secretive forest species, migratory, moves to Latin America in the winter. Scarlet tanager, which we could see tomorrow. Again, the best time to find scarlet tanagers is in the spring, when you can hear them, because even though they're bright red, they're not necessarily that easy to see. But this is a fairly common bird in the Dogtown forests now. Wood thrush, wonderful songster, also characteristic of forest and still occurring relatively commonly in Dogtown. Also, it's not just birds we're talking about. This is a fisher, a creature that, with the return of the New England forests, has also returned, and we're now seeing fishers more commonly. I live in the top of Portuguese Hill, which is hardly a wilderness community, but we have a little bit of woodland behind us, etc. And I had a fisher run across our lawn the other day. So they're here. They are not fisher cats. They are not cats. They are large weasels. You want to keep your cats away from them, but other than that, they're perfectly native, decent animals. One of the other key things that is we're very fortunate to have in Dogtown is wooded swamps like this, sometimes called red maple swamps, because the dominant trees tend to be red maples. And they, like the forest and like the grasslands, have their own endemic, so to speak, species, characteristic species, including the spectacular wood duck, which actually nests in tree cavities in wooded swamps. Barred owl, fairly common, though you have to keep your ears open if you want to encounter a barred owl. I just heard about a recent one actually in Dogtown, not very far from here, less than a mile from here. And then heathlands, and this is one of the characteristic habitats, sometimes in Gloucester. This is Halibut Point in the fall. but this kind of habitat, which consists of black huckleberry, blueberries, and then, coming in now, some sort of larger shrubs. You can still see some red cedars here and there. And this is a habitat in which is also diminishing sort of state and region wide, and has species that are, slowly winking out, especially in Dogtown, a lot of which was this habitat, and we now just have little pieces of it. Poles Hill, in addition to Dogtown, retained some of that. Poles Hill's gotten a recent burn, not a prescribed one particularly, but that will actually probably encourage the regrowth eventually of this kind of heathland. And this kind of heathland is pretty much the sole, this is just black huckleberry in bloom, which is a species, by the way, that contains volatile oils that actually encourages fire. It's obviously in huckleberry's interest to have some fires every now and then, or it will go away and be out-succeeded by forest. This is a painting by Winslow Homer, who, as you know, spent a couple of seasons here in Gloucester, living on 10-Pound Island, among other places. Whoops, sorry. And these young ladies and young men are picking what? Blueberries, right, yes. Yeah, when we talk about, prescribed burning and the heathland and whatever, it's very clear when I talk to audiences about that one of the prime excitement possibilities about that is restoring those days when people and their families or whatever went to Dogtown. Why? To collect blueberries. So that's a deal. I always wonder what the little bird up on the branch is. Winslow Homer he kind of knew his birds, and he had a number of paintings that included birds identified by species. So I'm not sure about that. It's not any of the following. So this is eastern towhee, used to be called rufous-sided towhee. This is a male. Females replace the black with a brown color. Again, characteristic of this heathland habitat, and now getting scarcer and scarcer on Cape Ann. This wonderful bird, brown thrasher, somewhat of a skulker, but if you know its call and its song, it has a wonderful rattly song. It's in the same group as the mockingbirds and the catbirds, again, very closely tied to the heathland. This is sort of a different this is kind of a mix of heathland, grassland. You can see the old cedars there with some taller shrubs. And this is favored by species like field sparrow, another species that's declining, that likes those tall shrubs, but only with open country all around it. I know of only one or two places now on Cape Ann where it still nests. Prairie warbler, 30 to 40 years ago, I knew 4 or 5 nesting sites for this bird. Now I know of none. Again, because it needs one of these successional habitats, and once the successional habitats succeed into the next more robust form of growth, the prairie warblers go away. This is another bird more or less in the same category, something called Nashville warbler. These birds, a lot of birds have odd names. This one, Nashville warbler, is not because it only occurs in a certain area of Tennessee. It's because Audubon or one of his buddies shot a Nashville warbler around Nashville and sent it to Audubon to be stuffed and painted, kind of. So another thing that comes in, especially in the more sort of barren, sort of rocky areas after a burn or whatever, is pitch pine, and we're seeing that coming in as this current burn is happening. But there are areas as you go through Dogtown that are dominated by small areas of pitch pine. That's another native habitat that is fire associated and would be good to have. Among other things, those barren areas, especially areas with pine, are one of the few places that whippoorwills nest. And again, this is a species that once there were, there was a lot of these open areas. These birds nest on the ground, right on the bare ground, and they need open areas over which to fly and feed, as this bird is, or this whippoorwill is somewhat improbably chasing a Cecropia moth, which is basically a day-flying moth. But anyway, we'll cut Audubon some slack on that one. This is an Audubon print. And among this is one of these butterflies that is not uncommon, but you'll never see it. Why? Because it inhabits, it feeds on red cedar, and if you want to go look for it, you have to go into areas where there are tall red cedars, and then look right at the very tips of the red cedar, and you'll find this butterfly, which is called olive hairstreak, which I don't think quite does it justice. And it's about the size of a quarter, but wonderful species, but one that most people never get to see. As the heathland continues to quote unquote develop, and these larger shrubs come in, there are many wonderful stages, and one, if we were going to try to manage habitats, that you'd certainly want to preserve some of in some way. This is in East Gloucester. It's conservation land in East Gloucester, much of which is heathland. Some of the open country species that I showed with the larger shrubs is in this same conservation area. And this is shadbush, or Juneberry, or amelanchier, called by many different names. And very beautiful, very brief bloom in late April up to about mid-May at the most. Nice white pine coming in there in the background. And at this stage, like in May, is when the vast majority of our woodland birds, migratory birds, are coming back from their Latin American wintering grounds. And so this is just a depiction, Charlie Harper's depiction of migration. It's actually called it refers to it's called the mystery of the missing migrants. And what it's really doing, it's got a whole variety of all of these are actual species. You can identify all of them, but many of them have conservation issues. And he was pointing out that more and more that migration, the bulk, the quantity of birds in our migrations is getting more and more sort of limited. So again, we come back to this idea of management, and well, shouldn't we just let nature take its course and leave it alone? Well, of course, we've never done that for millennia, and our record in how we've managed, even though we don't think we're doing habitat management, is not great. But there's a well-known technology used by many conservation organizations to manage habitats and preserve areas of successional habitats as well as mature habitats in a methodical way that preserves enough acreage for them to thrive, or et cetera. So just sort of hand cutting and mowing is one obvious methodology. Scary as it might seem to think about today, since we're getting plenty of fires without anybody setting them, but actually prescribed burning is a well-known method for inhibiting fire by making fire lanes, by making fire breaks and things like that. And there are technicians, people who are trained to do that without letting them run away and burn your house down, which is, of course, is something that one would worry about. Just a shot of, and then in order to maintain certain areas, there are now places, when I was Director of Conservation at Mass Audubon, we did a lot of burning and management of the Nantucket heathlands, because they were getting greatly grown in by a variety of native species. Just the succession was taking over, but there were a lot of rare species within those habitats. And so one of the ways that was used to maintain the heathlands and the grasslands was to put herbivorous animals on the property for a limited period. So as I was saying, people accuse ecological management types or people who want to mess with the landscape as playing God. And I would just say that if so, we're not doing a very good job of it. We've been playing God, as I said, for millennia really, but in a kind of helter-skelter kind of way. And I would argue that one of the things that we should be looking at for as we develop as the new Dogtown Commission. I point out for emphasis that this is not a committee. I've been involved in Dogtown advisory committees since the dawn of man, and this is now a city commission. So in theory, we ought to have the city's ear about what needs to happen in Dogtown. As Cindy was pointing out, this compost area, which some of you will see tomorrow, is a high priority to get that out of there and restore that area to something more natural, but in the process also to look at a variety of other aspects of Dogtown that need some management attention. It's worth mentioning that going back to the 1980s, a very thorough 50-page management plan was developed addressing all kinds of issues from safety to education, ecological management, all of those things. But we could never sell it properly enough. The good news, as again Cindy was pointing out, is that Dogtown's still there. It hasn't, unlike the Bayliss text, it isn't covered with houses. It isn't covered with industry. There is no airstrip, which was actually planned, of course. They're not even windmills. So it is there for us, and that's a wonderful thing. I think the next stage is to just take proper responsibility for it so that it can be as Dogtowny as it can be. So I guess that's my message. Thank you.